In this talk, I want to turn to the question of marriage and marriage choice and the rules that constrain marriage. But the most difficult problem of all is, what is marriage? If you go into a registry office, such as the one in Cambridge, you'll see written on the wall for the prospective partners the following definition. Marriage, according to the law of the country, is the union of one man with one woman, voluntary entered into for life, to the exclusion of all others. Now that definition is more or less the same one as the one given in the Notes and Queries to Anthropologists, except they've left out according to the law of the country in an attempt to make it a universal definition of marriage. Unfortunately, as with many words taken from Western contexts, the definition doesn't work at all well when you look at other societies. For instance, what about between a man and a woman? If you take the case we looked at of the newer marriages, you find marriage between a woman and a woman. And of course nowadays some societies in the West allow marriages between homosexual consenting males, man-to-man marriages. Or the newer case of the ghost marriage. It doesn't need to be someone who is alive in order to have a proper marriage. You can even have instances where you don't marry the whole person of another individual. In some societies you can have a man marrying a part, or a woman marrying a part, for example marrying the ear of another individual. There is a proper marriage ceremony, but by that means you can succeed to their office or inherit their property. There are other objections to the universal definition of marriage. One is the question of the nuclear family. We tend to think of a marriage setting up a group of people who live together and who act as a married couple. But we've already seen in the case of the Nayars and in the matrilineal puzzle that in fact you may have a situation where marriage leads to no home being set up by husband and wife. Or again, you have the consensual or common law marriages which now occur in many parts of the world, particularly in the Caribbean and nowadays in Western industrial societies, in which you have fluctuating unions, no marriage perhaps, but people living together who are taken to be husband and wife. And in such situations, do you talk about them as marriages or not as marriages? In their attempt to widen the definition, anthropologists have given longer and longer definitions. For example, one is marriage is a relationship established between a woman and one or more other persons, which deals with polygyny, which provides that a child born to the woman under circumstances not prohibited by the rules of the relationship is accorded full birth status, rights common to normal members of his society or social structure. It's very cumbersome, and anyway, you can find that there are exceptions even to that wider definition. Another approach is to break down marriage and to see what are the constituent features. What are, in the words of Edmund Leach, who has borrowed the metaphor from the great historical lawyer Sir Henry Maine, what are the bundle of rights which go together in a marriage? One way of looking at this is to look at the two different kinds of rights that occur. And the two major types of right that have been outlined are possessive rights. That's rights in rem, as the lawyers call it, rights in a thing. And on the other hand, personal rights, rights in personam. Now, the rights in a thing is a right which is in relation to a certain person, but against the whole world. In other words, you have a right, I have a right in this object, which are my rights against the world using, taking away, destroying that object. If it's infringed, my right in that object, then I can claim recompense. If someone steals it or destroys it or damages it. Thus, among the newer, adultery is treated as a theft. And if someone steals your rights in the thing, which is the woman you've married, then you have compensation in the form of a fine. And it gives you rights in the person as a reproducing agent. rights in genetricem, as it's called, in the generating powers of a woman, in her childbearing potential. Again, in the Nuer, it is the fertility of the womb which a lineage receives by payments of the bride wealth. Those are things which you get, and they are your rights in a thing. These rights need to be distinguished from the personal rights which you have in each other and which we have when we marry. For example, in the relations between a husband and wife, each partner has personal rights imposing duties upon the other, such as sexual access, a right to sexual access, a right to food providing, a right to clothing and shelter. These are rights in a person as a partner. Now, the curious thing to us is that in many societies these bundle of different rights. In our society, a husband has them in the wife and the husband, and they are all just part of one bundle. In many societies where marriage is much more important, different people have different parts of this bundle allocated to them. It's not all in one person. For example, among the Dahomey, described by Laura Bohannon, rights in the woman as a breeder, rights in genetricem, were attained by the group into which the woman had been born, which is a patrilineal society. Her patrilineage continues to have rights in her as a breeder of children, while her rights as a marriage partner, sexual rights, rights to her labour and so on, goes to her husband. Among the Yoruba patrilineal society of Nigeria, the sexual, procreative and some of the domestic rights go to the husband and his group, his patrilineal group. The economic power of the bride, that's her ability to make money, stays her own. She has those rights in herself, whereas her domestic services in certain circumstances, when they're required, remain with the group in which she was born. Because there is always this ambivalence. A woman is part, since descent flows through males or females, but women remain part of the patrilineal or matrilineal group in which they were born. And so that group often retains some rights in her even after she's married. Edmund Leach has in fact suggested that the major types of right which are transmitted and are encompassed in marriage are the following: to establish the legal father or mother of the children, and all these are reciprocal rights; to give monopoly of sexual rights of a partner; to give partial or monopolistic rights in the domestic and labour services of the partner; to give rights in the property belonging to the spouse; and to establish a joint fund of property. And finally, a rather curious one, to establish a socially significant relationship of affinity between a husband and his wife's brother, a social relationship between the two groups. And as Leach puts it, in no single society can marriages serve to establish all these types of rights simultaneously. The institutions commonly described as marriage do not all have the same legal and social concomitants. In other words, marriage is one of these words which you have to define in each social context because it means something slightly different. Leaving on one side whether you can have a universal definition, how in fact, if people are going to set up a childbearing unit, how are these set up? How are marriages set up? Well, here again, our own culture is rather unusual. As Hobel, an American anthropologist, put it, few people are so given to romantic love as are Americans. Very few societies consider this matter of how you set up a marriage to be in the hands of the couple who are going to actually live together. Marriage, as you might say, is too important a matter to be left to those who are going to get married. It is the case that in some very simple societies it is the partners who choose, but usually there are great pressures and great concern by the wider society. A marriage is of immense economic, political and economic concern to others, and the emotional link between the pair is of less importance. As Radcliffe Brown put it, a marriage is essentially a rearrangement of social structure. It alters all relationships, and all those affected want to have a say in it. In Africa, he says, a marriage is not simply a union of a man and a woman. It is an alliance between two families or bodies of kin. Thus, the rules which dictate it are of central importance in these kinds of society, and it's been a concern of anthropologists to look at these major types of rule. Turning to these rules of marriage, one of the most helpful distinctions that has been made is by the French anthropologist Lévi-Strauss, who has distinguished two major marriage systems in the world. There are elementary structures and there are complex structures. The elementary structures of kinship are those systems, and I'm quoting from him, which prescribe, they tell you must, marriage with a certain type of relative, or, alternatively, those which, while defining all members of the society as relatives, divide them into two categories, viz. Possible spouses and prohibited spouses. So there are very strong rules about who you must and must not marry. Complex structures, of which Western industrial societies are an example, are reserved for systems which limit themselves to defining the circle of relatives and leave the determination of the spouse to other mechanisms, economic or psychological. Another way of putting this is that in elementary systems, which comprise most human societies, you can actually work out who you must marry, or a person must marry, at birth by looking at the kinship structure. It's embedded in the system. Certain cousins are eligible, others aren't, and you can tell roughly who a person will marry from the moment they're born in that way. For example, among the Yanomama described by Chagnon, a male must marry a woman of the category called suaboya, meaning the word means wife. To state it more precisely, Yanomama society is characterized by a rule that enjoins a man to marry a woman of the specific kinship category. He has no choice with respect to the category. Within that small category, you may have a little bit of choice. Thus, there are explicit rules and norms about whom you should not marry and whom you should marry. In complex systems, such as our own, one may, in theory, marry anyone outside a very narrow range. You can't marry your parents and your children, but anyone else, basically, or grandparents or grandchildren, anyone else you may marry. And as a result, you have a very wide choice. In such societies, you can't determine at birth who a person will marry. You can statistically work out various tendencies that people will tend to marry people of the same economic and social background and so on. But you can't, if you go up to someone and ask them, who should you marry, they will look at you with some surprise and say, there's no rules about that. Putting it in another way, there are distinctions between positive rules and negative rules. The positive rules state that one should marry a certain category of relative. If there is a very strong rule, then it is known as a prescriptive rule. One must marry so-and-so. If it's a weaker rule, it's known as a preferential rule. It's preferred that you marry someone. Negative rules are proscriptions. One must not marry within a certain range of kin, or one must not marry someone too far away. Then turning to another kind of, or turning again to the proscriptions, one has, the major proscription is the rule of exogamy. One must marry out of the group. This should really be retained for where one has formal groups of lineage type. One must marry out of the lineage. And in other societies there are very strong rules that one should marry within the group, and that is known as endogamy, within the group. Gamos, of course, is from the root of marriage. And thus, John Beattie says, often the rule of the exogamy forces men to marry among their actual or potential enemies. A most important function, what it does for the society of exogamy, is to bind together through affinal, that's through marriage, and later through kinship links, separate groups which, taken together, make up the social aggregate. And indeed, this has been one of the major interpretations of the reason for many of these rules, is that it holds the social structure together. As Lévi-Strauss puts it in a metaphor, if it weren't for these rules which force you to marry in certain directions, the society would freeze. It would always marry within a very small group, and the wider links would be broken, and the society would, in many ways, either freeze or fall to pieces in endless warfare. Now, that isn't to say that we don't have rules of a negative kind in our society. In fact, if you do any statistical work, you find that people tend to obey all sorts of invisible pressures. In the United States, for example, it was discovered that people almost always married within the same religious group, much higher rates marrying in that way than one would expect statistically. And there are racial, class, age and other rules. We believe that we have a free choice system, but in practice we don't. The most famous type of positive rule that has been discussed by anthropologists are the systems of cousin marriage. And here we need to introduce just one more set of jargon. Marriages on the father's side are patrilateral. Marriages on the mother's side are matrilateral. If you marry someone of the same sex as your father, in other words, you marry someone who is your father's brother's daughter, the same sex, then it is a parallel cousin marriage. If you marry someone who is of the opposite sex, your father's sister's child, it is a cross marriage. So anthropologists, for example, have discovered that the most common form of marriage in simple societies, strangely, is a prescribed or preferred marriage with your matrilateral, your mother's brothers, that's cross, your matrilateral cross cousin, your mother's brother's daughter. Why should this be the case? Well, there's a large debate on this. The most famous two theories. One is that you feel something special about such a relationship. You feel warmly towards your mother's brother, who is an uncle on your mother's side. You feel warmly towards your mother. You feel warmly towards her brother. You feel warmly, and you marry the daughter on that side. An argument from sentiment. An argument from structure, advocated by most anthropologists now, like Levi-Strauss and others, is that if you look at a diagram of this system, strangely enough, you find that it operates in a rather different way from marriage with your father's brother's daughter. And in essence, it links together larger sets of people, the mother's brother's daughter marriage, and therefore the argument is that societies needing to hold together large sets of groups of relatives prefer or have evolved in this system, and as a result, matrilateral cross-cousin marriage is much more common. In the reading that should accompany these lectures, particularly in the work of Robin Fox, one would find a description of these complex systems.